Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we step inside the stone walls of a medieval castle to see what life was like for a king. Imagine the echo of footsteps in great halls, the weight of a crown upon your head, and the burden of ruling over restless lords and loyal subjects. A life of power, yes, but also of constant watchfulness and fragile peace. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you as a fellow knight of these tales to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what other period of history you would like to experience. Now take your place on the throne. The castle doors close behind you. Chapter 1. The Morning in the Castle. Our story begins in the castle of Highford. Imagine you are a king in the year 1272, taking bread in the great hall while a clerk waits with a charter. The hall ran long beneath its timbered roof, the board laid upon trestles, the dais set plain as a workbench. Men of the household stood by custom in their places, and the guard kept its watch at the screens. A dog nosed at a boot, and a boy in livery counted cups and set them right. The clerk watched with a patient face, for he knew the day's turn would be long. In a little while, riders would come with word of war and tax, and names would be called, and burdens measured, and a march set out on the map. There would be the office no crown can put aside, and the heart would have to be steady when friends asked for mercy. That was coming, as weather comes down the road. But for now, the table stood simple. The bench held an easy seat, and care kept its distance like a guest who waits at the door. But for now, the smell of peat smoke rested in the rafters, and crumbs lay tidy by the knife. A king, like any man, begins with small customs. That was the way of things. Bread was taken in steady bites, salt laid with 2 fingers, and the first matters of the day set out in plain talk. The board was a small kingdom of its own, with cup, knife, and trencher kept in good order, for a man rules better when his place is neat. The clerk waited with the folded charter, wax tags ready, and the hand that held them did not tremble, for he had done this service often. Names of reeves and towns were on that skin, tallies of rent, and a field or 2 offered in return for peace. No riddle lay in it, only the steady traffic of duty. A nod settled the sense of it, and the clerk moved 1 page down, then another. There would be a mark made later, and oaths taken, and the shape of a day's labor would be set by the end of the first cup. The boy who poured stood proud to be trusted, and it did him good to be seen. The steward kept his count with a half smile, pleased when the pieces fit. The taste of coarse bread sat clear on the tongue, simple and honest, as if the land itself had greeted its master. That was a fine start, and the crown felt lighter when work began in calm. Talk in the great hall ran along the rails of habit, and small signs made the big things seem plain. A messenger's boots told of his road before any speech. A steward's raised brow told of a storehouse before any list. The old songs said a king hunted each day and spent coin like water, but that was a singer's trade, not the truth of it. The truth was this: benches to be mended, grain to be counted, men to be told where to stand, and kind words for those who held the walls when their hands were tired. A hound tucked itself under the table and kept still, and the guard at the door shifted weight without calling attention. The hall was given a settled face, because calm gives calm, and fear grows or shrinks by what it is fed. A letter from a distant earl lay beside a knife, its seal unbroken until the clerk could witness it. A map marked with charcoal waited for a clean thought. A pale bar of light lay across the board from an arrow slit, sharpening the edge of a plate like a drawn line. That was the rhythm of power, humble at first glance. Work with parchment began once the first hunger was past, because a clear head deals fairer blows than an empty belly. The clerk set the charter before the board, read the words, and waited at each place where consent belonged. There were lands granted for service, fees owed for wardship, and a mark put to say a road could be repaired without quarrel. The talk walked steady, never hasty, and the sense of right made its own comfort, better than any pride. Questions were put when a phrase ran crooked, and the clerk gave plain meaning without show. Then the scribe leaned in, and the great seal was spoken of, and old forms were recalled to keep faith with those who came before. The matter was not theatre, though a hall may look like a stage. It was the stitching of a coat that others must wear. A lord who serves is taught by the care taken in these lines, and a peasant learns he is seen by the mercy folded into them. The scratch of a quill travelled across the skin like a small plough through a field, and the work sat sounder because that rhythm kept the pace. That was how authority held together. News of the shires did not wait for ceremony, and messages seldom brought only gladness. Men came up from the yard with mud on them from a long ride, speaking of sheriffs who feared riot, of a border where steel had been shown, of market towns asking a fair share when tonnage was named. The hard part was not choosing who would bear the load, but explaining why the load had to be borne, and holding neighbor to neighbor without tearing the cloth. The steward was asked how many carts could be spared without starving the villagers, and what barns still had last year's grain. He answered plain, and the numbers were a comfort because they told the truth, even when sharp. A king, if he was worth the name, did not hide from sharpness. A clerk beside kept a tablet of names, and a messenger stood steady, waiting for the next word to carry. The weight of a damp cloak rested on the shoulders as the men stood near, from a saddle that had pressed hard through the hours. That was the way with messages. They always arrived wearing the road. Between matters, a small ease was made so that tempers would not fray. A jest ran down the table and was kindly allowed, for a house breathes better when laughter is given a path. The carver spoke of a pig gone missing and found asleep in the ashes the next morning, and even the old marshal hid a smile behind his hand. A king who forgot to laugh, forgot to listen. The two went together more often than men admitted. The steward brought talk back to coin, and the almoner spoke of the poor at the gate, and each thread was woven without knotting the next. Others spoke first when pride was near, because pride feeds on haste, and patience starves it. A parcel of wool was mentioned for a widow, and a bridge repair for a village downstream, and the sense of keeping held the group like a belt. The taste of watered ale touched the back of the tongue, thin but clean, a small promise that thirsts could be met without waste. That was how a hall stayed steady, duty set in the middle, kindness beside it. Power often looked like thunder in stories, but it more often lived in the space between two thoughts. A map was studied without fuss, and men were sent for advice rather than for show. The juster way was slower, so patience had to be taught to the heart, which liked to leap. Promises made at harvest and pledges taken at Yuletide were remembered, for memory was a kind of fence that kept a ruler from wandering. A note to the reeve of Northley would mend a slight, and a kind word to a stubborn lord would cost nothing but pride. The steward's careful sums had already kept two quarrels from breaking into feuds. That is the sort of heroism that seldom finds a song. It was enough to know it was there. The smoothness of the oak armrest under the palm gave a small anchor, while the mind worked through hard knots, and steady things like that were worth more than gold in an unsteady hour. That was the way of care, steady strength, plain tools. When the first light of work had been done, the shape of the rest of the day could be seen. Petitions would be heard in the solar, and men and women with proper claims would come in order, and the clerk would keep his neat row of notes. That was the true game of rule, not the riding out that poets liked, for most of a reign was hearing, weighing, and deciding. The king stood, not as a hero in a tale, but as a householder who must see to many rooms, and the hall took the move as its cue. The steward nodded to set the next duties in motion, and the guard shifted to attend the stair. A king might act alone, but he walked with many hands. The cool of the stair stones under the hand marked the turn from board to bench, from bread to names, from private thought to public hearing, and that small change held more weight than any trumpet. That was enough promise for one morning, and the day moved upward towards seals and petitions. Chapter 2. Seals and Petitions. The day in the solar had begun with steady order, as if the stones themselves approved of quiet work. The bench by the narrow window held a folded cloak and a stack of rolled charters, and a careful clerk kept his place beside a low table where wax had been left to soften. A brazier stood in the corner, and its warmth pressed close like a familiar companion that never asked for thanks. Chairs creaked as men shifted their weight and found their courage, and the first petitioner watched the doorway as though it were a chapel door. The crown had been made for this kind of hour, not for shouts and banners, but for small talk and binding promises. That was the way of things. A steward murmured names, a sergeant kept the line, and a page carried the little chest that held the seal. There had been days of riding and nights of hard camp, but the craft of ruling was mostly this, the taking in of words, and the setting out of answers. It felt like mending a net so it would not break on the next hard pull, and the habit of it steadied the heart. Old training made the hands move without rush, and the face kept calm because a king led storms best by keeping his own weather still. Petitions came one by one, like beads pulled along a cord. A reeve asked to settle a boundary hedge, and two men from the same parish stood side by side like brothers who had forgotten how to laugh. A widow spoke of dower and winter grain, and her hands told her grief better than any speech could. The clerk bowed, dipped his quill, and kept to his quiet trade as if this were a harvest of ink. The scratch of the quill on calfskin seemed to count time for the room, steady as a spinner at a wheel. A thoughtful word went further than a shout, and the old rule held true. A fair answer today spared sword work next year. It was never simple, yet it did not have to be cruel. A guard at the door shifted his weight when voices rose, then stilled when they fell. Men were quick to calm when fairness showed itself. This was how peace was earned, stitch by stitch, while the small folk watched and weighed every move. There were days when it felt slow, but slow had its own kind of strength. When talk turned to land and oaths already made, the seal was called for, and the little chest was set on the table as if it were a reliquary. The clerk unlatched it and showed the die with care, and wax was spooned to a round on the lower edge of the parchment where the words had found their rest. The great seal had weight that was more than metal, and its face carried meaning that even a ploughman could understand. The scent of beeswax lifted softly, sweet and clean, and gave the act a quiet kind of solemn joy. A cord was drawn, a fold was made, and the circle met the wax with a final press that felt like a hand laid on an oath. Men craned to see, yet kept their distance, for the seal had its own majesty. It was not magic, though folk sometimes spoke of it that way. It was craft, law, and habit, and the trust of a realm taught to obey signs. Nothing bright or showy marked the moment, but hearts eased when the seal took the field, and the matter was bound as firmly as a door set on its hinge. That was how paper turned into promise. Money followed land, it always did. A steward opened a small coffer, and a ledger hand turned over names and reckonings, set down in winter when the fields were quiet. There were arrears noted with a neat mark, and gifts made for favor with a careful word that kept pride in its place. No man loved to part with coin, but most understood that walls, bridges, and garrisons had to be fed like cattle, or they would fail. The soft clink of coin in the steward's scale sounded like rain beginning, a measured patter that said the sky knew its work. There were also debts forgiven for good cause, and those grants did not weaken the crown. They bound hearts with a tie stronger than iron. A frowning man learned to bow when the reasons were laid out plainly, and a smiling one learned to listen when asked for more than he had planned to give. The rule was simple enough: pay what kept the roads safe, the river ford watched, and the winter store strong. Hard years came and went, but keeping account in clear daylight made hard years pass. A realm was a longhouse, and the roof stayed tight because many hands kept the thatch in place. Not all matters fit neat on a line. A baron of short temper made his case with a voice that squared his shoulders, and his steward nodded too often, like a man watering a stump. The guard shifted nearer, not in threat, but in reminder that doors closed on quarrels when they grew too sharp. A promise long ago had been tangled by kin and weather, and a pathway cut by carts lay through the edge of a disputed wood. Courage was a good tool, but patience was better for this kind of knot. That was the lesson learned 100 times in halls like this. The red glow on the stones by the brazier painted a calm on the floor, and the room seemed to lean toward quiet rather than heat. Words were sifted gently until the heart of the trouble lay plain, like a nail found at last in a plank. A shared path and a rental due each harvest set pride back on its feet. When the baron took the new bounds with a deep breath, his neck eased, and the day moved on as if it had always meant to do so. Townsmen waited after the great folk had been heard, for they understood the dance but did not hold the music. A guild spokesman and a baker's kin came in with damp hems and caps in hand, and each blinked at the painted wall like men who only knew such brightness at church. Trade needed safe roads, fair tolls, and simple rules noted where a man could see them and not be tricked. A grant for a stall in the market and a right to keep a scale in the open needed words neat enough to hold their shape. A writ was drafted in the clerk's small hand, built from old phrases that did not break when the wind changed. The smell of wet wool rose from the line of men, a homely scent that spoke of honest days out in weather. The king's peace was not only for fields and lines on a map, but for a shop door that could close at night without fear. There was a quiet pride in seeing town and crown learn to pull together, like two oxen set under the same yoke. Work done in good order made the next morning easier, and that too was part of rule. Midday brought a pause that men took with thanks, heads lower and talk gentler. Bread was set on a board, a cut of cheese came after, and a small cup eased the throat that had carried the weight of other mouths. A page lad stood close, ready with a cloth and a smile too quick for court, and it reminded the room that youth moved the world along, even when elders believed they did. A single sip gave the taste of watered wine, thin and clean, and it set the mouth right for more listening. Memory wandered to an older hand on a shoulder. Long ago, a father's low voice teaching that a crown was not a hammer, but a whetstone to keep men honest. That lesson had returned, again and again, on hot roads and in cold rains, and it had never failed. There would be riding soon and harder talk under open sky, yet the balance of the realm began in rooms like this, where patience met petition, and both found a home. The pause ended, the board was cleared, and a steadier breath began the work once more. The last of the afternoon's matters drew the day to its close with a kind of homely grace. A monk asked passage for a cart, and a miller's boy sought fair hearing for a father who had spoken too sharp. Each found what was needed, a way opened here, a caution given there, and a promise made before witnesses. Seals cooled on their cords, and the clerk set the charters aside with a care for edges that looked like love. There would be muster at the gate before long, banners to pull from chests and men to call from hearths, but the ground for that march had been set here, under roof and rule. The weight of the mantle on the shoulders at last felt like a thing that rested rather than pressed, and that was mercy in a king's long day. Doors were closed with a measured hand, and the brazier's charcoal was raked so the coal would keep a heart for morning. Warm faces went to other rooms, cooler ones left with a new duty to think on, and no one shouted. The realm breathed out together, as if the castle itself had taken the measure of the day and found it sound. Evening waited, and tomorrow would be met in good order. Chapter 3. Muster at the Gate. Morning in the outer yard had been a broad, steady thing, like a tide that answered the moon. The host gathered under the walls, men from near manors and far valleys, pressed close by duty and by the names on the tallies. Grooms tightened girths while pages shifted under loads too big for their age, and a clerk with a short board counted heads with a dull stylus, patient as a miller counting sacks. Orders moved down the lines by raised hands and short nods, and the square grew into shapes a captain could read without trouble. The weight of the crown had not been metal alone, and the shoulders held it as a farmer holds a yoke. That was the way of things when a country looked to its lord. There were old men among the flags and young ones who still grinned when a flag lifted, and each heart brought its own worry to the stones. A marshal waited near the gate, quiet, watchful, with a habit of catching what others missed, and that steadied the work more than a shout ever could. White breath from the horses drifted in slow clouds, rising and fading by the racks, a small proof that men and beasts were ready for the road. Letters sent the night before had gathered them, seal and word doing their quiet work. The yard had seen such mornings before, and the stones remembered, even when men forgot. Captains brought the foot together by manors and hundreds, and they sorted themselves without fuss, the way plough teams fall into the old furrows. A sergeant counted off by tens, each man stepping forward, and another wrote the number on a scrap before tucking it into a pouch, because memory could fail when a field filled with men. Long poles stood upright like a fence where the first line waited, and behind them came a second line with round shields ready to step forward if the front thinned. Simple words set the order: stay close, move on the sign, keep the ranks straight, hold the ground till the flag moved. It was not clever talk, but it was the kind that saved lives, and that was enough. A priest walked the front with a cross held high, saying a short blessing for steady hearts, and some men bent their heads, and some held their chins level, and no one was left out by it. A man hunched on a stone and set an edge on his iron with a flat stone, patient, careful, making the same stroke again and again. The rasp of stone on metal carried into the lines, thin and faint, and it reminded all that work came before war, as it always did. A boy with a broken belt was placed to the baggage instead of the front, and no one called it shame. That was kindness in the old measure. That was the truth kings learned too. Near the gate, The marshals formed the mounted retinues into their own clean blocks, each man knowing his place by the flag he followed since snow time. The constable waited on a gelding that had seen 3 summers, and he spoke steady with the names of the roads ahead and the fords worth keeping, so that the order of march had a shape as clear as any map drawn in ink. Messengers stood with small staves painted red and white, and they were told where to ride and how to come back, because news made a line strong and foolish speed made it weak. The household knights drew up by pairs, then by 4s, then by 8s, until the weight and point of them were plain without a word. Lances would be held low when they were sent, level as fences, and no man would break from the line to chase a boast, not today. Your hand settled on a strap and found the leather rough with old sweat, and the bite of it into the palm brought the mind to the simple work of holding fast. That was a better lesson than any long speech. A comrade beside asked once more for the bounds of the chase, and the answer was short. Clear the hedges beyond the ditch, then circle and return to the road. Pride had its place, but the march belonged to order, and even bold men understood that rule when a realm moved. They went out first, the chosen spearhead, not for glory, but to sweep the lanes, so that the long tail of wagons would have a safe start. The line of pairs folded into a wedge as it passed the ditch, each man closing his knee to the next, each eye taken by the point ahead. Lances settled under arms in the old proven way, tips steady, shafts braced tight against the ribs, and the earth before them seemed to lean back a little, as if it knew what such a shape could do. A few bold riders waited beyond the far hedge like thorn birds, hoping for a loose cart or a slow groom. They turned when they saw the press and the measure. No one chased. The wedge moved at a trot, broke to a hard press for 50 paces, and then eased to a walk, so the line kept its breath for the rest of the work. Hooves rolled a low thunder through the sod, a drum under the ground, and it carried the thought ahead of them that the road was claimed. That was enough for a first hour. A raised hand brought them right, and they curved back toward the gate, with the task clean behind them. Then the signal went for the main host, quiet and plain, and the blocks began to walk in a line that could be held all day. The front guards turned on the road beyond the hedge. The carts moved after them, and the foot behind kept the space they had been taught to keep, 2 men to a step, so the tail would not bunch. A flag tipped, the gate crew made their own small bow, and the iron teeth came up. You spared a last thought for those upon the wall who would keep the home behind the stones. The word was given, and the walk became a march, steady in the old time. The portcullis fell behind with a full bright clang that rang in the timbers and told every head the same thing at once. That sound marked the leave as clean as ink on a page, and there was no need for any more speech after it. That was how a kingdom moved, without shouting, each part knowing the weight it carried. The pace was set, neither hasty nor slow, and no man had to guess his place. The road took them between fields left for spring, and the hedges gave way to wet ditches and old willows, and still the line held. Scouts ran out from the sides in pairs, a bowman and a rider, and came back at set places, so nothing on the banks would surprise the column. Water was counted like coin, with barrels at the first halt, and skins sent to the stream under guard, and the carts closed up again when the word came. Children from a hamlet stood on a safe patch, and their mother made a short sign with her hand that might have been a wish or a warning. A king always hoped it was both. The pages learned the pace fast, hunched but stubborn under bundles, and the old ones kept an eye on them, for that was how a camp grew strong. Letters sat in a chest under a guard's cloak, to be opened at noon when the road allowed a stop. Dust rose light from the hooves and the boots, and it set a dry taste on the tongue that said the march had truly begun. No one complained, and that made the way easier. By midday, the line had learned itself, as a team of oxen learns the pull together, and there was less need to watch every yard. The van kept a gentle lead, the baggage held the center, and the rear guard stepped strong in its turn, so that no gap grew to invite fools. A rider came in with word that the next ford was clear, and another brought a rumor of a lord's brother sulking on his land, and both bits were folded into the pace without fuss. The thought came, as it often did in such hours, that fear was a guest like any other. Given a place and simple rules, it behaved. Boldness had its room too, but it was told when to sit and when to walk, and that was your work as much as any stroke in battle. The past had taught the lesson hard, and the hands did not forget it now. Sun laid a steady warmth on one cheek along the way, and it felt like a small promise that the day would hold. That was comfort enough to share along the ranks. Before the second halt, thoughts turned to the other part of the crown's work, the kind that did not shine in banners. Quarrels would rise where the road went, over pasture, over debt, over a word given and taken back, and they would need a hearing before tempers turned to knives. A bench could be set on any green, and a clerk could spread a strip of parchment across his knee, and a matter could be weighed while the horses rested and the men ate. That had been the habit of good years, and there was no cause to forget it, just because the host moved. A comrade beside asked if the hall would open on the march, and the answer came easy. Justice did not sit only behind stone, it walked as well, because folk needed it where they stood. Plans for the morrow were made in short, clear words that even tired heads could keep. The leather under the saddle gave a soft, slow creak with each step, like a low answer that agreed to carry the weight a little farther. With that sound behind the thoughts, the day settled into its long stride, and the road ran on ahead, waiting for the next duty. Chapter 4: The King's Justice. The benches in the great hall filled again, not with spears and shields, but with faces that had come to be heard, and the long day turned from iron to ink. A stool was set on the dais, the same chair used at feasts, though today it held a different sort of weight. At either elbow a clerk kept a roll, and a sergeant stood to call the names in a firm voice. This was the other part of a crown, the quiet work after the riders had gone, and it asked for patience more than daring. Old quarrels crept forward in simple coats, and hard words from last winter's snow shaped themselves into claims. A reeve from a far hamlet nodded to a miller and tried to look brave. A widow pressed her lips thin and waited her turn. It was strange how loud a hall could feel when it was only full of worry and hope and not armor. The first petitioner knelt and kissed the step, then rose to speak because that was the way of things when order held. In the wide space above, the low murmur under the beams rose and fell like a tide, and a steady hand could calm it. The first case was small, as small cases often trained the mind for larger ones. A miller swore the reeve had shorted him on the toll for grinding after the summer flood, and the reeve swore back that the flood had ruined half the grain anyway. It sounded like nothing, yet there was bread and winter at stake, and men grow sharp when hunger stands at their door. Witnesses spoke, careful and afraid to give offense. The constable held them to the point and kept tempers from fraying. A fair rule sat in memory. The mill took its measure, not a spoon more, and the village kept its share, not a capful less. Coins were not always the answer. Sometimes time itself set things right with a slow and honest count. A hand lifted, and both men were told to bring the written tallies from the granary and to keep the peace until the numbers were seen. In the slant of noon, dust danced in a thin ladder of light, and patience seemed like work one simply did. Then a peddler was led in between two men from the town gate, accused of taking a bolt of blue cloth and claiming it had been paid last month. He looked more tired than wicked, which was often the look of trouble on the road. When the crier called for oaths, the tale turned muddied, as such tales do when promises and memory mix. 12 townsmen were named to speak to his goings and comings, and the assize in the hall took shape from their words like a path worn by feet. Not all judgment was iron. Some of it bent like a willow so it would not break. A writer read back the sense of the thing, and a fine was set where a whip would have soured the town and done no good. Mercy sat beside law as a quiet partner, and both had their place if peace was the aim. While the ruling was spoken, the carved edge of the oak chair pressed cool under a palm, and its steady bite reminded that a firm seat helped a fair mind. In the afternoon the talk grew heavier. A lord with a hawk on his glove came late and sour, with a face that said he had rather be anywhere else. Ode service was named, and he muttered of swollen streams and sick horses, as if the river had signed his oath and not his own hand. The truth stood plain. He had not ridden when called, and hard riding had fallen to men with less land and more duty. The answer was the old one, known to every hall since fathers taught sons to hold ground and keep promise. He could buy himself free for this season, not from faith but from saddle, and the crown would take scutage in coin and remember his tardiness. Payment did not wash away a name, it only wrote a new line beside it. The chest was opened with a key, the tally marked, and the hawkman's purse grew thinner while pride stayed thick. Each piece struck against another as the count was made, and the sharp clink settled the point without more words. Next came land, the kind of quarrel that lay low and smouldered, then showed its heat in a dry spell. Two villages stood with their elders, each sure the other drove swine too far into the oaks and robbed the mast, each swearing their grandfathers had set the stones on the right side of the brook. Forest was not just trees, it was meat and leather and winter bacon, and the poor held it in their hearts. A simpler soul might swing a sword and be done, but borders obeyed old steps, so the order was given to walk the bounds again. Men who knew the lay of roots would go with rods and mark where the memory matched the hedge and the brook, and where it did not, they would set fresh stakes. Angry hands fell when they heard it would be done in the open, and with witnesses on both sides. Truth loves daylight when it is given a chance. As they turned to leave, a breeze moved through the doorway and brought the clean smell of crushed thyme from the trampled rushes. Paper and quill made their own kind of field, and victories came in clear words rather than cries. Clerks bent their heads until necks went stiff, drawing steady lines so a man could tell his right without noise. Charters were read aloud, slow enough that even the shy could say if a name was wrong. A seal was warmed and pressed, and wax caught the mark like soft earth taking a boot print, ready to lead a man back to his own path if he ever lost his way. It was plain work, and plain work often saved the most trouble. The scribe at the right cut a quill to a sharp point, then looked up for the nod that meant the king's mind had settled. Doubt came now and then, as it will to any soul that must choose between kin and the wide peace. Yet a clear sentence can lay a solid log across a stream. When the last roll was tied, the fresh ink lifted a faint, resin-tart smell that steadied the head and cooled the worries into shape. Punishment had to fit like a well-cut shoe, not pinch and not flop. A boy was brought forward for taking a loaf from the bakehouse, thin as a reed and brave enough to stand still instead of shake. The baker's anger had burned hot this morning, yet by afternoon even he saw no gallows in it. Bread was life, and theft could not be blessed, but there were many doors to mercy that still locked fast against folly. The order was given for a short day in the stocks to meet the town's eyes, and after, a place in the kitchens where hands could stir and knees could learn the feel of honest hours. In time, a man remembers who gave him his start and keeps the peace for that alone. Judgment, when it is clean, turns enemies into neighbors more often than not. As the boy was led away, his cap slipped and brushed the fingers that waved him on, and the scratch of rough wool sat in mind like a small and decent promise. By dusk, the hall breathed easier, like a beast that had been worked and watered. The clerk stacked the rolls, the sergeant set a guard at the door, and the last petitioners bowed their thanks and shuffled back to their homes. Rulings did not end the world's troubles, but they gave people a way to carry them without breaking. That is what a crown was for on quiet days, to be a strong fence so fields could keep growing. Outside, a watchman crossed the yard and looked toward the road, as if news might ride by at any moment. Tomorrow would bring more words, or iron, or both, for that was the pattern of a king's year. For tonight, the mind could untie its knots and trust the work would hold until morning, the way a good seam keeps a sail steady. In the dimming, the slow orange wash of the nearest brazier painted a gentle band across the stone, and it drew the eye toward rest and the next duty to come. Chapter 5. Stone and String. The day at Highford had begun with the world narrowed to walls and duty, the kind that left no room for grand words. The enemy had settled about the hill through the night, and trenches and frames had grown out there like hard weeds. As king you had chosen to hold, and that choice sat quiet inside the chest, steady as a kept oath. The engine crew stood by their great frame, ropes coiled, faces set, waiting for the sign that set the work in motion. A marshal lifted a hand, and the men moved as one, as if a wheel had been turned and gears had slid into place. The counterweight dropped, the sling loosed, and the stone went on its way, out and over, carrying more than weight, carrying will. It was careful work, and careful work needed calm hands, which was the heart of good defense. The plan had been simple: break the tall works they had raised, and keep the line along the top course of the wall solid and unshaken. One measure guided the hours, a sign that the whole castle could feel without a clock or bell, for a deep thud rolled up from the engine with every cast, and that sound marked the day's slow march. Along the walk atop the curtain, men took places as they had been taught, not bunched, not slack, and space left for messengers to pass, and for the water carriers to come and go. A captain kept his voice even, and orders moved like water, finding the right stones, filling the right cracks. Crossbowmen rested their short bows on the notches and waited for the nod to send a bolt, then stepped back so the next man could take the gap. It was a dance learned from fathers and uncles, from seasons of petty raids and long quiet weeks, and the body remembered even when the mind ran ahead. Shields covered the men who fitted cords and drew the short triggers, because patience was as useful as bravery when days were long. It helped to think in lines and turns, not in sudden feats, for the wall had to be held like a stubborn plough cut across a field. Far out beyond the ditch, a pale cloud of dust lifted where the stones struck their timber work, and that sight steadied hearts in a way sums and speeches never could. The folk below answered with their own craft. Tall frames rolled forward by slow inches, and ladders rode up on broad shoulders. Picks bit into the base of the hill, and a shallow trench crept closer, a handspan each hour. Inside the wall, it had been set that no one drew back from his place without another to fill it, and that the barrels and baskets near each stair stayed full. A night passed in mail, not as a show but as a sign that rank stood where the danger stood. From time to time the engine crew needed another shot, and then the rush thinned so a new stone could be winched and checked and set just so. Men on the top course kept a slow beat, squaring their steps, setting their feet, and giving the work of defense the weight it deserved. There had been tricks enough in old tales, and some proved useful if done calmly. The pits of tar were kept close and covered, and when the word came, a lad prized the lid, and the sharp smell of pitch rose, faint and bitter, like a warning that belonged to another age. Every shot had to be measured, and even a king's will could not bend a stone's path, so hands and heads bent to the small things that made a cast true. The crew had shortened the sling when the first tries fell long, then let it out a knot when the arc ran too short, the kind of simple choices that drew men together around a shared job. A steward kept count with small cuts on a scrap of wood, not for pride but for sense, so no one burned through stores too fast in a single burst of zeal. There had been a notion to send a small party outside through a side door and pull the nearest ladder down, yet the thought died once the trench line grew less than a bowshot away. What mattered had been a steady edge at the top, a line that did not fray, even when a captain fell, or a brave fool climbed too far. That line had found its anchor, wherever a palm settled on stone, the rough grit under the skin, holding a body steady in its place. And that simple touch reminded all why calm hands still won days like this. Midday, they tried again with more breath and more bodies, hoping weight alone would break sense inside the walls. Ladders reached and rattled, and a few took hold, and then the hard, close work began, where names meant little, and habits meant all. Men worked in pairs and then in pairs again, one to watch, one to act, trading places at the word, so bow arms did not tire, and the line did not suck air like a fish on dry ground. Someone passed a skin for wet lips, then moved on before a name could be said, because nothing slowed time like talk where a simple nod would do. There had been no glory in it, only a rolling push and set, as regular as a farmer's day. A few bold souls tried the top rungs, and found only oak and iron waiting. In that press, breath came short and hot, and the mouth filled with the taste of iron, the kind that came when fear and duty rubbed together, a taste that told a man he was still himself, and that this work would carry on until dusk. By late light, the ground outside had changed. A new line showed where they dug toward the wall, not deep yet, but low and guarded. Inside, a foreman sent 2 files down into the earth to listen and feel the way of the dirt, for the castle could not be kept by stone alone. The men went in tight turns, no heroics, no rush, and each tool went on a hook when the next took hold of it, because this was how a house was kept from the roots up. Stories had always made such work sound grand, yet the truth had been closer to chores in a long winter, steady and dull, but worth doing to see spring. A clerk took down what went where, and who had done what, not because a ledger saved lives, but because a mind at order kept hands at order. Overhead, the engine groaned and then quieted as the crew waited for word, and each small hold of the door, each simple nod from a captain, bound the castle into one piece. Somewhere in the dim, a little flame trembled in a tin lamp, and that wavering light carried courage far better than loud boasts ever had. The frame stood again when the order came to throw at their nearest tower, the one that shadowed the ditch and gave their men a path up under cover. The crew had learned the grain of the arm and the stretch of the cords. They worked without fuss, hands set, feet placed, faces still. It had been slow work to teach the great thing to answer the small touch, to settle each pin and loop so that stone rode clean and true. Down along the top, the line never broke, for the men who carried bolts had learned to pass and step away without blocking the turn at the gaps. As king, you had watched for that single slip that turns a day, and when none came, patience grew like a quiet tree inside the chest. A messenger from the yard came and went, and the rhythm held, not quick, not lax, a pace that belonged to people who had put down roots on this hill. The winding finished, the sling was cocked, and then the vast arm moved again, because that had been its nature. Ropes tightened and sang in their own way, a slow creak that spoke of weight and will pressing forward together. When the shot came right, it marked a turn no trumpet could mark. The great stone found the place where joints were weak and timbers met at a bad angle, the kind of flaw a careful eye learned to love. The work outside faltered, not from panic, but from the simple truth that wood could only do so much when broken at its heart. A few cheers rose in the yard and died without scold, because joy was allowed in a hard day, but the line did not slacken. Runners checked the stores, and buckets moved toward the gatehouse stairs in case the next push came where the way up ran steep. As king, you had let the cheer stand and then set a quiet tone again, for that was a ruler's task in a tight hour. Give the hope, keep the rule. A priest passed along the walk with a hand lifted, saying words no one needed to hear to know them true, and that small shape steadied the edge as well as any order. The crew wiped their hands and set the frame again, and the ropes answered with a dry groan, the sort that grew from wood and fiber doing what they had been made to do. Chapter 6. Hearth and Chapel. After a week of engines and tense councils, the great hall settled back into its old shape, as if the stone had exhaled. Benches stood firm again beneath the long boards, and the servants' steps grew steady as they set out bowls and cut slices from yesterday's loaf. A few lords still lingered, speaking in low tones about land and duty, but their eyes had softened in the ease of the hall. You had called for the household to eat together rather than apart, for a king needed his people close, not just on the wall but at the table too. A steward counted in a calm voice at the buttery, more habit than caution. One thought chased another. Peace was a kind of work, a slow mending of small things, and the mending began here. A comrade sat 2 places down and nodded once, and that simple nod mended a little more. The old tales spoke of kings eating like giants, yet the truth wore a plainer coat, and it wore it well. In the middle of it all, the orange glow of the hearth laid a gentle stripe across the table, and that light felt like a promise kept. It was not glory that held a realm, it was steadiness, and that was the way of things. The meal itself had been simple. A boy carried in a clay bowl and set it upon a thick heel of bread, and the kitchen winked at the thought of it vanishing quickly into mouths that had been fenced by hard days. The steward lifted an eyebrow at how much had been served, but he said nothing. He knew that victory tasted safest when shared. A spoon lay by the bowl, its edge worn smooth by many meals, and a small grace passed from lip to lip before hands moved. This was not show, this was fuel and fellowship. Talk turned to roof beams that needed checking, and to a granary wall that had been weeping, not to boasts. It helped to remember that a realm was not carried only on banners but on bread. Even a king learned that lesson again and again. When the first mouthful went down, the salted taste of pottage steadied the body in a way speeches never could, and it reminded one of the good labor behind it. It was fair to think that, beneath rank and rank, people sought the same comfort, enough to eat and enough peace to eat it in. That was the way of things. After the bowls were cleared, a small circle formed near the lower end of the hall. An older servant told a riddle about a river that ran backward in winter, and a page tried to answer but fell into grinning silence when he saw the twist too late. A captain told a story of a mare that would not cross a bridge until her own shade stepped aside, and it made 2 grooms exchange looks a horseman would understand. The myths of roaring courts did not match this homely knot of talk, yet this was the truer court, where people learned one another's minds without armor between. The king's chair stood a little apart, not by pride but by custom. and it felt right to let the talk wander without being driven. A scribe, off duty, rolled his shoulders and shared a memory from a village fair, and the sense of the hall loosened again. It was not nothing to be a roof under which fear thinned. A comrade beside murmured that songs made the night shorter, and it was true. The small twang of a plucked string rose now and then, and its thin voice made the room feel sewn together. That gentle stitch was its own kind of rule. When the time came to step to the chapel, the hall thinned, and a path opened toward the door that faced the close. A few poor folk waited outside, as they always did, and there was no scorn in that. Hunger knew the turn of this doorway. A purse lay in the hand, leather creased by long use, and silver and copper sat like quiet choices between one need and another. You paused, not from doubt but from care, and set coins into smaller hands with a word for each pair of eyes. Mercy needed names if it was to hold. A baker's widow curtsied with awkward grace, more used to kneading than to speaking to a king, and a man with a scar asked for no word at all. A comrade lingered back, letting the gifts pass cleanly, for pride should never shadow alms. In that small lane between stone and step, power bent the knee first, or it was not power worth holding. The chill of coin against the palm felt like truth, cold, bright, and best spent for others. That too was the way of things. Inside, the small chapel held a narrow stillness that had outlived many storms. The priest waited in his place and gave a slight bow that asked nothing and welcomed everything, which was the best kind of welcome. The kneeler by the front rail showed the marks of many years of use, and it had known the weight of joy and sorrow in equal measure. A guard stood back by the door, not watching the king so much as watching the peace itself, which always needed watching. Prayers went up with no need to impress, only to frame the day and place it back into hands wider than a crown could hold. The old stories promised shining visions to great men, but most nights faith came like a sensible friend, asking decent questions and going room by room with a small lantern. A page crossed himself with careful fingers, and one hoped he would keep that care when life gathered speed. In that near calm room, the small flame at the altar bent and straightened, and its faithful little stand felt like counsel. There had been many battles, and there would be more, but the heart had learned to stand still. That was the way of things. After the prayers faded into thought, the priest stepped near and spoke in a steady voice about small matters that were not small. A mason's son who had run off from his work, a hedge dispute that might turn sharp if left to grow, the thorny question of a debt owed by a man too proud to ask for time. The world did not rest only on banners. It rested on how people were guided back to one another. A talk beside the rail found a fair path. The boy would return to his line, the hedge would be marked by 2 elders, and the debt would be eased for a season, with a promise set down and witnessed. It was not weakness to bend where bending mended. The priest thanked the king without fuss, and the answer came just as plain, for neither office did well with showing off. Outside the small door, a comrade offered a cloak against the night, and duty felt simple, as if a hand had reached to steady a ladder. The rough rub of wool at the neck met the skin and reminded the mind to keep humble, even wearing a crown. That too was the way of things. Back in the hall, the company thinned further, and talk turned to watches for the walls and stores for the week, each promise made like a brick laid. A steward stood by and set down what was decided, for words needed homes if they were to hold. The captain at your right asked for 2 more men at the East Tower, not because danger loomed, but because good habits had to be fed. A messenger waited with a note from a market town about a weighbridge that had sagged, and permission for repairs seemed the easiest gift a king could give. A cup came then, plain and honest as the work it followed, and a comrade raised his own in quiet goodwill. Old songs spoke of cups that promised endless joy, yet the best cup was the one that marked a day done cleanly. The sweet taste of mead rested on the tongue for a moment, and drew the shoulders down, as if a knot had untied. You let that small comfort stand unchallenged, for a realm did not grow strong by denying simple goods. That was the way of things. When the hour grew late, the steps turned toward the stair, and the small chamber above the hall, where sleep waited like a patient friend. A guard took his place outside in easy silence, and a servant drew the curtain just enough to set the room apart from the world. Thoughts walked their slow round, names of men who needed a word tomorrow, a letter to send across the river, a field that might be too wet for hooves if the rains returned. The bed stood close to the inner wall, its boards dependable, and its cover the same one used in other seasons, for waste had never kept a house. It comforted the mind to see simple things do their steady work, while big thoughts tried and failed to shout them down. Stories said kings slept on feathers and woke to trumpets, but the true crown lay heavy only when a day had been left untended. That had not been this day. Somewhere beyond the stone, the far hoot of an owl marked the hour, and the note seemed to bless the roof. With that, the next road felt nearer and kinder, and the night closed with a promise of morning. Chapter 7. Field of Banners. The host waited on open ground, where the road ran down from the ridge and flattened into pasture, and the line took shape without hurry, the way a field is sown in straight furrows when hands have done it often. The foot stood in the center with their captains, shields close, spears set, and a narrow lane left for messengers to pass. The archers had been sent to the flanks at first light, so their stakes were already in the ground, and they watched in that steady way men do when work is near. A few standards lifted and dipped as if the cloth could feel the day, but no one spoke of luck. This work had its own rules, and they were simple. Hold, listen, move when told. A priest had come along the ranks at dawn and left a small blessing behind, like a hand that presses a shoulder and passes on. The ground here gave no surprise, and that counted for much. The air felt damp upon the face, as if the fields had breathed out during the night, and that small coolness steadied thoughts that might have run. A king's place was not apart from his people, only higher in the saddle, and even that height felt borrowed. Such was the pattern of the world. Signals went out in small waves. A pair of riders passed along the line, stopping to trade a word with each captain, and then moved on again, like needles drawing one thread through many hands. The banner at the center held the eye of the host, not to charm it, but to show where the heart should be. On the left, a comrade pointed out a fold in the ground where a hidden rush might come, and a few files shifted as neatly as if they had been trained in a yard. More than one old soldier murmured a prayer that no boy would run too soon, and no old man would judge him for it if he did. Care, not fury, won fields like this, and care could be taught. Leather straps creaked under weight, a small sound that spoke of duty rather than fear. Orders had limits, courage had limits, yet attention had no end, and attention was asked of all. That was the quiet wisdom that settled on the line. The first move had been given to the wings. The archers on the right stepped up, then the ones on the left, and the rest of the line held its breath in a way that made time feel longer without anyone saying so. A marshal's staff lifted, dipped, and the cords went back to cheeks in one smooth draw that showed more practice than might have been guessed in winter months. What left the bow was not anger, only work done in order, each shaft part of a larger thought. The enemy's front slowed as men do when they walk into a steady rain that turns their faces down. These were not numbers on wax, but farmers and tenants and poor cousins with a lord's badge on their sleeve, and mercy began with good planning. A second signal rose, and again the wings did their duty, while the center kept still, and it was hard work to keep still when friends were already part of the story. A dry twang cracked through the air with each loose, and that small beat tied the line together. It was plain to see why old captains smiled at patience. That was how burden was shared. When the moment came, the wedge formed without fuss. The chosen riders brought their points together, front to back, until the shape narrowed toward the place where the enemy line seemed thinnest, and a path of need opened ahead. The talk was short: forward on the sign, keep tight, and do not chase past the mark. There was a kind of kindness in clean rules. The banner moved, and the horses stepped, then charged, not for glory, but because that was the part given to them. The place where the lines would meet had already been counted and agreed, and the rest was craft. A courtly song might praise shining deeds, but the riders felt only breath and leather, and the pull of purpose. The point carried a single thought: break the crust, let the center move, then return to guard the core. A word went down the files to keep the men on the flanks ready to fill any gap the wedge cut. The first clash gave a hard jolt that ran bone deep and cleared the head at once. So went the weight of a promise kept. Close work began, and time loosened its hold. The riders pushed through and drew aside to make space for the foot, who arrived in steady ranks like a door closing on a draft. A comrade's mount stumbled, rose and found its place again. Taught by many drills to follow the bit without panic, a gap appeared and was filled, then another, and the whole line seemed to breathe as one chest. No one shouted more than needed, because words wasted strength that might be put to better use. On the right, a short rush pressed the archers back for a moment, and then the men of the nearest block stepped over to lend weight, as agreed. A lad looked for a leader's eye and found it, and that was enough to turn his hands from wild to steady. This was not the time for new tricks. Old measures, learned in bad years and good, would carry the day if men kept to them. The smell of trampled turf rose green and raw, and it made the present real in a way that stories never could. Such truth was stern and fair at once. The enemy tried to fold our left, so word went from rider to runner, and from runner to file, and the archers slid along their stakes like a lid meeting a pot. A short push from the center eased them, and the other wing answered with its own firm step, which showed that both sides knew their work. A second wedge gathered, smaller than the first, meant not to break but to pry, and it went in and out like a tool used well, and left the wood unspoiled. Friends fell, and were pulled clear by hands that did not ask names, only lifted and set down, and each small kindness steadied more men than a speech could do. A chance to chase flashed across the front, and it tempted more than one heart, but limits were kept, and the line held shape. The day would be won by shape, not by brags. A bright glint flashed from a helm on the far rise where the other lord stood, and that sharp spark looked like a thought pausing. That was how a field could turn, on a moment of pause. At last the press eased, not as a shout but as a slackening, and the ground between the hosts grew wider, in careful inches. The riders drew back to the flanks to guard the archers and the gaps, and the center took a short step forward together, showing that no fear lived there, only order. A herald moved out with a staff and a steady hand, and his small figure did what steel could not, which was to ask for sense. It seemed a strange magic, but it was only the sight of a life that might be spared in exchange for a promise. The other lord sent men to lift his fallen and to carry word that he would yield the road and send hostages until terms were spoken in proper time. That was enough for a king who had fields to keep and mouths to feed. No joy rose at another's loss, only relief that the work would end before anger grew wild. Flies droned over the cut grass as if they had their own rights to keep. In that plain sound, the heart learned its size again. The line opened, and the field became a place of chores more than trial. Water skins went down the ranks, and a name was taken for each hurt man, so his kin could be told, not with cold letters, but with care. The fallen from both sides were gathered to one patch, and a clerk marked the badges so ransoms and burials would not be muddled later, and that small justice kept hatred from growing claws. A lad who had stood steady received a word and a touch on the cheek, and he might remember that longer than any pay. The archers pulled up their stakes and bound them in bundles for the cart, and the foot set their shields on the ground to air the day's effort. No one spoke loudly, because quiet felt like a roof after rain. A few riders went out to see that no fresh band waited beyond the hedges, and they came back with easy faces. It was in such plain endings that a rain found its worth. Cool water tasted faintly of tin and steadied the mouth for speech. Peace would be the next labor. Chapter 8. Peace to the town. The gate opened, and the road bent down toward the town, a brown strip that had known cart and hoof for years. After banners and trumpets on the field, the day asked for quieter work, and a king did not refuse that call. The host had gone back to their shires, and a smaller train followed the royal pace. A few spearmen, a clerk with his roll, and a chaplain who kept his prayers for the turns in the path. You rode a progress to make peace, because war had stirred the pot and left bitterness at the bottom. It was not grand, but it was needful. The dust of the road roughened the throat, and a swallow did little to help it. A man who wore a crown still had to breathe like any other man, and that was always a good thing to remember. The hill eased as the houses rose, and the work of walls and roofs showed where hands had built and hoped. The rains went slack, and care sat easier when roofs and ovens came into sight. It felt like turning a page without tearing it. That was the way of things. The town lay tight under the castle's look, with lanes that twisted as if they had grown there by themselves. Doors stood half open, and faces watched from behind shutters, measuring the mood of the day, as merchants will. The guild wardens waited by the market cross, wary men whose eyes weighed gain and loss, and still feared the press of soldiers more than the pinch of a lean season. Their bows were proper, but it was plain they wished to hear if peace meant fairness, or only softer words for the same burden. The smell of river mud came up from the bridge, a thick note that told where trade met water and coins changed hands. These were folk of ledger and stall, and they did not give trust unless it matched the count. That was no insult, it was the craft of their lives, and it could be guided without breaking it. A nod was given, and the party moved in step to the meeting place. So it went when a crown came near coin and bread. Inside the hall where the guild met, timber held the roof like the ribs of a great beast, and a long board bore marks where men had leaned for years. The clerk set down his bag, drew out the roll, and placed the blank for the new grant on the table's edge. No swords were on show, only stamps, strings, and a little pot of wax, because here words did the binding. The masters spoke of tolls on carts, of safe days for far traders, of who kept watch when strangers came in, and they spoke with care because they lived with the weight of each word. The scratch of the clerk's quill marked the pace of the talk, steady and slow. You listened more than spoke, and when a voice rose you let silence cool it, which was a kind of rule as old as any. There was no hurry, because hurry made frayed knots. One by one the misgivings were set down, and one by one the answers climbed over them, not with force but with patient steps. That was the craft of peace. When the hall talk eased, the king walked the lanes with the wardens, not as a judge now, but as a guest who wished to know how folk earned their bread. A brewer touched his cap and spoke of grain, a carter asked about repairs to the bridge, a woman at a stall asked for fair weights and fair space. It was simple speech, and it rang true because it came from work. The flash of dyed wool on a stall corner caught the eye as the seller spoke of roads and thieves and the fear that the war's tale would lash the countryside for months yet. It was not a complaint so much as a prayer for steady days. Such talk did not weaken the crown. It clothed it, as a body is better for a plain cloak in rain. You answered in few words and promised an officer to weigh the measures each fair day. A promise like that did not empty the purse, and it filled the heart better than harsh commands. That was wisdom learned not in books but in winters and thaws. By noon the square had filled, and the warden asked that the writing be made public, for rumour travelled faster than truth unless truth had legs. A platform stood near the market cross, and the chaplain climbed with the clerk and the royal sergeant, while the townsfolk edged close. The charter was read in clean words that men who held stalls could grasp without a scholar. It set the days, the places, the duties for watch and ward, and the right to gather and sell without fear so long as the king's peace held there. When the reading ended, you raised a hand, and the clerk brought the seal, because a promise rested better with that sign than with memory. The ring of the bell from the tower rolled over the square at the moment the clerk pressed the wax, and the crowd held still as if the sound had pinned time in place. A cheer went up after a breath, not wild, but calm. It was enough. That was how a town learned to breathe easy again. After the cheer, the guildmasters asked for a few words in private, as men will when the public part ends, but the small stones still lie on the path. The walk back to the hall was unhurried, and patience had its own kind of dignity. The talk turned on toll at the gate, on who paid first when the harvest ran thin, and on the watch who should bear the duty by turns so no house bled more than its share. The roughness of the oaken bench under the palm steadied the temper, when a younger man spoke too quick, and an older one took offence at it. It was not anger, not at its root, only fear that favour would pick winners and leave others to carry the load. So the king told how the fine taken from a past quarrel had been set aside to mend the bridge, and how a fishmonger's son had been sent home without a beating after a brawl because the town had shown goodwill today. That kind of tale cooled the room. That was the right use of memory. Later, the party moved through the wards, so the sight of the crown would match the words on the parchment. A pair of lads ran behind, pretending to be knights until a mother called them back, and a man from the far village thanked the guard for the quiet rides on the road since the last raid had been turned. A small quarrel over a stray sow was settled with soft questions and a promise to replace a broken fence, which cost little and made two neighbours nod. The smell of malt drifted from the brewhouse yard, and it sat with the day like a hearth story at winter's edge. A few coins were given to the poor at the gate, not to buy praise, but to ease hunger that knows no charter. Peace grew in such tiny spans, like mortar pressed between stones until rain could do no harm. You felt the burden shift, not vanish, and that was as it should be. A crown is not a magician's wand, it is a steady hand over time. Evening drew the party back up the hill, where the walls held the day's work as a jar holds water. The town sank to its own business, and the promise on the parchment began its quiet labor without more words. The horses walked slow, and the talk among the men fell to simple things, fodder and sleep, and who would ride watch. In the solar a table waited, and the morrow's task stood clear, for peace in a town did not last without taut hands at home. A small glow from a single lamp marked the room where the heir would sit, and in that light the sums and rents would be shown with the patience they deserved. You thought of the market cross and of faces that had lifted when fear loosened, and you held the day like a coin meant to be kept, not spent foolishly. So the door of the castle closed, and calm rose as steady as tide. That was enough for one chapter. The next belonged to a father and a son. Chapter 9, Teaching the Heir. The day in the solar had begun as a lesson, not a judgment or a muster, and that was a gentle change. The boy sat by the table, legs still a little short for the high chair, eyes set on the wooden stick with its little cuts and marks. A clerk stood near, ready but quiet, and the pages kept to the doorway to keep pride from crowding the boy's thoughts. A tall window faced the yard and gave space to think, but the talk stayed close to the table where the true work waited. Today the crown's shape was small and plain. It rested in a father's hand and in a son's steady nod. There were no riders with dust and news, and no lords with scowls like closed doors. This was the kind of day that made a kingdom hold together, stitch by quiet stitch. The boy asked what each notch meant, and a slow answer brought names of men, acres of oat fields, and a promise that counted even when no one watched. Duty lived best when it fit the palm, not just the throne. From the hearth beside the table came a soft crackle that seemed to mark each word, as if the fire itself kept the count. That was fitting, for a home needed number and care as much as a host needed courage, and a king's home was the realm. The clerk laid out a roll and a little pot of wax, and the boy read the lines in a careful voice that made patience grow in the room. Each line tied a person to a field, or a rent to a promise, and the words were plain enough when the heart stayed calm. A father had learned long ago that the ease of the hand mattered as much as the strength of any sword. Coins came, coins went, and bread went from oven to table, and all of it was law made warm by being lived. The tally stick showed the sum, and the roll gave it letters to stand on. The boy asked why the stick was split, and the clerk smiled as if to say there were two sides to every bargain. The split kept both halves honest. That was the old way, fair because it did not trust pride. When the wax was set near the little flame, so a seal could be pressed at the end of the lesson, a faint scent of beeswax rose and made the work feel close to the earth. That was how sober tasks smiled without jesters. The stick itself weighted like a small truth. Its notches were thin and thick, neat and stubborn, so each cut told a number, and the sum of a man's year could be read in lines a boy could trace. The lesson was not only how to count, it was how to see people inside the numbers, to hear bread ovens and sheep and mill wheels when a clerk said rents. The habit of a long rule came from such small habits. Cheating came easy in hard weather, and fear taught weak men to hide. But trust grew when both sides held a part of the same proof. The split halves married again when a debt was cleared, and that made a good end for all. The boy turned the wood to search the deeper cuts, and asked if one heavier mark meant a failed duty. There were such marks. A wise answer did not seek to shame, but to heal. The rough edge of the tally stick pressed into the boy's thumb as it crossed the grain, a small field to match a large promise. That was how a crown should meet a life, close enough to be felt. A reckoning board lay on the table, squares rubbed by many hands and many years of care. Counters stood in little rows like men on a field, and the boy slid them one by one to show the rents due at Martin's. The count rose and fell with each move, and a slow sum took form that even a tired mind could trust at dusk. A father watched and asked when to forgive and when to demand, when to take grain and when to take coin, when to make space for a widow's need without letting slackness spread. The board helped, because hands learned mercy better when they moved. Stories of the Shire, names of reeves, small fields by the river, all came in and sat down, not as tales but as lines reached across. The boy hesitated at a figure that would bite a poor Vil, and the pause seemed to say more than any speech. A thin stripe of light fell across the board and caught the edge of a counter, so that the lesson wore a quiet crown of its own. That was a good sign, for sight and sense often arrived together. The talk turned to lean years, for a king who forgot hunger soon lost his people. There had been autumns when the barns were not as full as the songs had hoped, and in those months a hard tally needed a soft hand. A memory was told of a steward who kept back a measure for the old and the very young, and how the hearth kept peace better than the sword when bread was short. That was the way of things. A full stomach listened, an empty one fought. The boy asked if that gave license to shirk. The answer was firm. Pity did not excuse fraud. Mercy did not erase duty. It mended it. The lesson rested there for a time, so no one mistook kindness for weakness. The clerk, seeing the weight of the moment, set a small tray near the boy and stepped back. A slice of apple touched the tongue with a clean sweet that did not argue or boast, and it shared the room without breaking the thought. The boy smiled and returned to the count with a steadier brow. Good teaching often walked with simple food. By and by, the clerk fetched letters from the chest, so the boy could see how words carried a king's will farther than a horse could ride. Petitions, grants, and a note from a far abbey lay in a stack that no one would have envied on a summer day. The boy read carefully and saw how a phrase could lift or bruise, how a promise made in haste sent trouble like a stone in a pond. Words needed the same clean cut as a tally. That was why the script stayed plain here, not fancy, and why the great pipe roll mattered more than a boast. It kept the realm from forgetting agreement. A father spoke of sending letters with calm hands, and waiting before setting a seal, and asking counsel when anger pulled. The clerk nodded, pleased to be useful, and the pages leaned in a little, without moving their feet. At the table's edge, the scratch of the quill made a thin sound that seemed to measure time better than any bell. That was how rule kept its pace, by a steady mark. When the sums were done, and the letters ready, the talk turned toward the things that cannot be counted but must be kept, oaths and counsel, and the quiet weight of command that settled even on a boy's bare head. A signet ring lay on the table, an old one, given by a father to a son when winter first taught him patience. It had marked wax on days when fear prowled, and it had pressed a promise on mornings when the sky smiled too wide. The boy picked it up, and the circle felt like a small world asking to be guarded. There was a warning here, gentle but sure. A crown was not a prize, it was a trust passed through hands like bread. Pride wasted it, listening saved it. Men wore their love of country in stubborn ways, and a king learned to hear that love behind coarse words. The cold weight of the signet ring sat in the boy's palm for a long breath, and he seemed to take the measure of it without haste. That was a sound beginning. Evening moved in without fuss, and the lesson let itself end, as good work does, with nothing left raw. The clerk drew back the roll and took the counters to their box. The pages relaxed so slowly that no one noticed. The boy stacked the two halves of the tally and set them safe for the morrow, and a father rested his hands on the table with a quiet pride that did not need speech. The realm would turn again tomorrow, as wheels always turned, and the shepherds in the hills would still count their lambs while the reeve checked the mill. A short prayer would be said later, and names would be laid in order so that when age came, the house would stand. That was wisdom too, to set a thing in place before sleep. The hearth fell low, and the embers glowed like little coals of watchful sight that kept the room from being only dark. The day's care thinned, and peace stood close by the door. It was time to think of rest, and of what must be spoken in the chapel, and the chapter to come would carry that calm into choice. Chapter 10. The King's Rest. A chantry had been set in the chapel at Highford, not as a grand boast but as a plain promise. It would stand to keep memory awake, even when the hands that signed charters had gone still. Endowments had been marked with simple words on parchment, and fields by the river were promised so a priest could say the prayers without worry for bread. The steward understood the sums, and the clerk knew the names, which was the old way of keeping order. A narrow altar had been put near the side, and a candle would be kept before it, so the years would pass, and the words would never stop. The priest, a steady man, had nodded at the duty as if taking up a familiar spade. He knew that service was built from small steps walked many times. The walls held stories of victories and mistakes, but they also held this plain pledge. In that corner, a path had been cleared between fear and hope, and it gave ease to have it drawn. The scent of beeswax marked the place as much as the stone. A ruler's days were full of demands and reckonings, yet the end asked for simple things. A name spoken, a candle tended, a place where love could stay useful. That had been the way of things in Highford, and it sat well with a heart that had known both storm and harvest. The council had been called on an afternoon, and the great hall filled with men who knew their places. Barons stood near the dais, lesser folk kept a respectful space, and the bishop held his peace until the moment came. Words of duty were plain, for there was no profit in making fate tricky. The son who had walked fields and counted rents with a tally sat straight, and the younger children kept still, as children would. When the clerk finished reading, the right hands were raised and oaths were spoken, not for show but for steadiness. It happened as you had hoped it would. The echo of those voices carried along the beams. Rings were touched, blessings given, and a simple prayer was said in thanks for order. There had been times when lords tried to pry fortunes loose, but today the knots were tied while all could see them. A steward lifted a staff and named the witnesses. A messenger hurried to the scriptorium so fresh copies could be made, which was the safe habit of a careful house. Trouble looked smaller when names were set straight. There had always been arguments waiting around corners, yet this work pressed them back. A king had many burdens, but the line had to be made clear first. That truth rested like a tool on a bench, ready to be taken up whenever needed. After the council, papers had been brought to the table, and steady work followed. Tenants who had kept faith were confirmed in their holdings, and old servants were given pensions that would keep hunger far from their doors. A strip of meadow went to the priests so the chantry would not fail, and coin was set aside so bread could be given at the gate on certain days. The clerk read each line, and the steward checked each measure, for errors bred quarrels in hard seasons. The ring that had sealed so many edicts was turned once and then pressed down where the wax waited. The cool weight of the metal met the skin. Messengers stood ready to ride, knowing the best roads and the firm fords. This was not glory, but it was the way foundations stayed true. The elder among the surgeons had once said a kingdom lived on its ledgers as much as on its swords, and he had been right enough. When the last strip of ribbon was tied, the table lay neat and the work stood finished. Give to those who served, and ask fairly from those who held land, and the wheel kept turning. There were always corners that needed a sweep, yet most of the floor was sound. A day could end with plain satisfaction, when the marks on parchment matched the marks in mind. The mason had come from the town to shape the tomb, bringing a boy to lift tools and sweep chips. He listened more than he spoke, which was the habit of a man who knew his craft. The likeness was not for vanity, but for memory, so a stranger in a far year could tell what sort of rule had been tried here. He measured the nose and jaw with a strip of cord, and marked the helm with small, patient cuts. The sword on the breast would be plain, because the best strength had always been steadfast in its duty. When he asked how the hands should lie, the answer came slow and steady, in prayer, not in command. Time had taught that lesson. He worked with a care that made the hours pass in good order, and no fuss rose from it. When the shape stood ready, the cold feel of your tomb's carved effigy under your fingers told you the shape of your rest. The carver watched without a word. Stone kept counsel and never rushed, and there was wisdom in letting it lead. There had been days of hard work and proud marches, but this task asked for a different kind of courage. To approve a face that would last meant accepting the road ahead, and that acceptance gave peace to a mind that had carried heavy loads. Before the season turned, a last round had been taken along the walls and through the yards. The captain at the gate gave a nod that said he knew what came next, and the cook asked if the arms at the door would keep to their days. In the mews, a handler lifted a glove and promised the birds would go to a trusted hand. The steward showed the stores, not as a display, but to let the mind rest easy on winter matters. Down in the town, faces opened as the party passed, for folk liked to be seen by their ruler, and small words traded in the market settled old worries. The smith paused at his anvil, and the reeve kept pace to speak of ditches and bridges. Here and there, boys made space for the horses and tried to stand tall, which lifted a corner of care. From across the fields, the steady turning of the mill wheel reached the ears. It had been the same sound in youth and in age, and it tied the house to the land like a rope ties a boat. Good care lived in the simple rounds. Keep the grain dry, keep the bridges sound, keep the peace fair, and most storms passed without breaking beams, that had been learned by patience and mending, the old crafts of a long rule. In the solar, the heir had come again, not as a child this time, but as a man who knew what heavy work waited. The maps lay where they always had, and the old chest gave up its store of charters for one last lesson. The ring that marked authority lay between father and son, along with a plain dagger meant for journeys, not show. Words came slow, for advice carried better when it was not poured fast. What to forgive, what to press, how long to wait before sending riders, when to trust a promise given under strain. These were the pieces passed, the way a craftsman passes a method. A jest was shared, because laughter taught steadiness too. A cup was lifted and set down together, and the taste of watered wine tied the moment to all the feasts that had gone before. The boy had once counted pennies, now he counted hearts. He understood that a crown was a tool, not a prize. No prophecy was spoken, only the plain hope that he would keep the fields sown and the roads open. That hope was strong enough for most days, and wise enough to allow for hard ones. Hands met, and the old strength flowed where it should go next. It was simple, and simple lasted when tempers broke. Toward the end, the chapel gathered the household for a short service by the side altar. The priest spoke the familiar words, and the clerk answered cleanly, setting a cadence that steadied thoughts. Bread for the poor had been made ready at the door, because mercy worked best when it kept a schedule. The bishop placed a hand on the heir's shoulder, and the old doubts that liked to creep in at night stayed back for once. Even the men who preferred the yard to the choir understood the value of a pledge made in common hearing. A single bell sounded from the loft, and its note held clear until it faded. In that space, a ruler could pray for those who would follow more than for himself. The heir bowed there, without fuss, and the household mirrored him. Such shared motion kept pride trimmed and turned sharp hearts towards service. It was a good pattern. The tomb waited along the wall, not far from the door, as if to say that the road forward and the road down lay within the same house. Nothing was hurried. A day like this asked for patience, which had been the best weapon against fear. When the priest finished, the new arms began at once, and a line formed that made sense of many old choices. Night gave way to morning, and the last tasks sat as simple as bread. The writing desk stood cleared, the seal ring lay ready for the next hand, and the captain had already changed the watch without being told. In the chamber, the bed held stillness, and thoughts rose without chase or trouble. Names came one by one, friends long buried, foes forgiven, fields reclaimed, bridges mended, and all of it felt like one path now. The work of years had not been clean, but it had been honest enough to make a town safe and a farm hopeful. That sufficed. The pale line of dawn showed at the arrow slit. It marked a change that had nothing to do with triumph. It merely showed that time kept its promise, the same promise the chantry would keep in stone and prayer. A last word was sent to the steward to keep the hearths tended, and a simple farewell was given to the men at the door. A clerk noted the hour in his neat hand. The captain bowed once and let the corridor be. In the yard, a stable boy stilled the horses. A breath went out, and a low peace filled the room. The crown did not fall, it passed. That was how a house endured. The road turned, and the feet behind took it, steady as ever. And so, our time within the castle walls comes to an end. The torches fade, the crown is set aside, and silence settles over the empty hall. Until our next tale together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.